They found it just after dawn, its steel plates still holding the night's faint warmth. American reconnaissance vehicles rolled to a halt, engines idling as crews stared at the silhouette dominating the roadside. A Koenigsteiger, 68 tons of German engineering, abandoned without a fight. For months, Allied intelligence had spoken of it in cautious tones, as if naming it too often might summon it. Yet here it stood alone, stranded miles behind the shifting front. Its presence was a contradiction the landscape could not explain. The men approached slowly, rifles raised, expecting motion from within the armored shell. The Tiger II was not an enemy to be taken lightly. Its very reputation suggested deceit. At 2,000 yards, it could obliterate any American tank, and at closer range, it seemed almost invincible. But now it was unmanned, its hatches sealed, its turret frozen in a half-turned gesture as though interrupted mid-thought. The soldiers circled it with the wary respect reserved for predatory animals that might only be sleeping. Up close, its scale became almost architectural. Armor slabs thicker than a man's fist caught the early light, revealing a metal geometry far beyond anything the Americans fielded. Officers moved forward, clipboard in hand, tracing serial numbers stamped along the hull. These were the identifiers of a prized machine, the product of scarce alloys, specialized factories, and a German war industry straining under bombardment. And yet the tank had gone nowhere. It had fired no shots. It had defended nothing. Frost gathered along the engine deck, muting the scent of burned fuel that still lingered in the air. A mechanized Titan that had once rolled across Europe now sat mute, defeated not by enemy fire but by its own stillness. The morning wind pushed dust against the tracks, drawing attention to a single fractured pin, small, unremarkable, and decisive. Here lay the flaw that halted a weapon designed to break armies. The soldiers exchanged quiet glances, sensing a deeper story beneath the metal surface. Something had stopped this machine long before they arrived. And in workshops far behind the retreating German lines, engineers were already confronting the same question. Why had their masterpiece failed? Long before the Koenigsteiger first appeared on the battlefield, Allied intelligence had framed it in terms usually reserved for strategic weapons rather than armored vehicles. Reports spoke of a super-heavy breakthrough tank, a machine conceived not simply to fight, but to dominate terrain by its presence alone. Analysts tried to determine its exact specifications, but the numbers shifted with every new intercept. In the minds of planners, the Tiger II became less a tank and more an omen, evidence that Germany, though retreating, still possessed the ability to unsettle the Allied advance through engineering audacity. When the first examples reached Normandy in the summer of 1944, their effect was immediate. Sherman crews watched their own shells glance harmlessly from the Tiger II's sharply angled frontal armor, a glacis plate nearly 200 millimeters thick in some sections. The sound of metal striking metal without consequence created a kind of battlefield silence, the momentary pause that follows the realization that a familiar tactic has suddenly become obsolete. Soldiers recorded these encounters in terse field notes, but the emotion behind them required no translation. Rumor carried the rest. Some crews insisted that the tank could be harmed only from behind and only at close range. Others claimed that its armor was so dense that even air-dropped ordnance struggled to penetrate it. In these exaggerations lay a deeper truth. The Tiger II had already won a psychological victory before many Allied units ever saw it. Its physical weight, 68 tons, was matched by the weight it imposed upon the imagination of those expected to face it. At the center of that fear stood the long-barreled 88 MKW K-43. Its accuracy at distance, combined with the velocity of its shot, created the perception of an invisible reach. Tankers knew that in any engagement, the Tiger II would likely fire first and decide the terms of survival. The Shermans that filled American armored divisions were capable machines, but they were not designed for duels with such an opponent. Their crews felt this quiet truth each time orders pushed them closer to German lines. And yet, here on a cold roadside, the invincible machine had been humbled without a single enemy shell. The contradiction lingered in the air, inviting a question that engineers and soldiers alike would soon attempt to answer. What had truly defeated the giant? Within the halls of German armored doctrine, the Tiger II emerged not as a mere successor to earlier designs, but as a deliberate attempt to reclaim a shrinking margin of battlefield superiority. By late 1943, German commanders had watched their once decisive panzers lose ground. To massed Allied production and evolving Soviet armor, The Tiger II was conceived as the remedy, a machine whose very presence would force the enemy to recalculate every advance. In internal memoranda, officers spoke of restoring initiative, a phrase that conveyed both ambition and quiet desperation. Its designers imagined a fortress in motion, a vehicle whose frontal armor and long-range lethality would make head-on engagements not simply winnable, but decisive. Every plate of steel, every meticulously machined component, fed into the belief that engineering could reverse the tide. This vision found its way into early trials, where the tank's impressive silhouette suggested strength even before its gun fired. To its advocates, the Tiger II was less a machine than a statement. Germany would answer overwhelming numbers with overwhelming design. Propaganda amplified this image with calculated precision. Newsreels showed the Tiger II rolling through model villages, crowds cheering as the camera lingered on its massive tracks. Narrators spoke of invulnerability, of an armored spearhead that would restore order at the front. Each frame implied inevitability, that the machine would not merely participate in battles but redefine them. In a war increasingly shaped by attrition, the reassurance carried political value. Officers echoed these claims, insisting that superior engineering would offset enemy production. They argued that the Tiger II's armor could neutralize Allied firepower and that its gun could outrange nearly every opposing tank. Yet beneath this confidence lay a quieter truth. Trial crews reported mechanical strain, suspension failures, and engines pushed beyond their intended limits. Their warnings were noted, sometimes acknowledged, but rarely allowed to temper expectations. As the Reich contracted under bombardment and encroaching fronts, the Tiger II became something symbolic, an emblem of technological hope at a moment when resources dwindled and strategic choices narrowed. Belief filled the gaps that reality could not, and in that widening distance between faith and function, the seeds of the machine's ultimate irony were quietly taking root. In the factories where the first production models emerged, few yet understood how deeply that irony would shape their fate. In the design rooms of Henschel, the Tiger II began not as a weapon, but as a debate, an argument carried across drafting tables where engineers wrestled with the legacy of earlier failures and the pressure of a deteriorating war. Armor thickness became the first point of contention. Some argued for incremental improvement, mindful of weight and mechanical strain. Others insisted that only a radical leap, a glacis plate capable of defeating any Allied gun, would restore Germany's armored dominance. In meeting after meeting, protection triumphed over restraint. Each calculation added millimeters of steel, and with them, tons of burden no engine of the period was meant to bear. As battlefield reports filtered back from the Eastern Front, the numbers rose again. Accounts of T-34s appearing in ever greater waves convinced designers that survivability mattered more than agility. Weight increased steadily, almost quietly with every revision. Thicker side armor to counter flanking shots, reinforced turret cheeks to withstand high-velocity rounds. The tank grew heavier on paper long before its first prototype rolled out of the factory. What had begun as a successor to the Tiger, I was now moving toward an entirely different category. An emperor of steel built to endure punishment rather than avoid it. At the center of the design stood the long-barreled 88 MKW K-43. Its range and penetrating power were unquestioned, and its dimensions dictated the rest of the tank's outline. The turret swelled to accommodate recoil length, the hull stretched to maintain balance. With each adjustment, the gun became not simply a component, but the anchor around which the entire machine revolved. Engineers understood this compromise. The weapon that made the Tiger II feared would also define its vulnerabilities, amplifying the demands placed upon its drivetrain, suspension, and fuel consumption. Yet on the drafting board, assumptions persisted. Assumptions about refined alloys, precision machining, and high-grade manufacturing tolerances. By 1944, Germany could no longer guarantee any of these. Factories operated under blackout conditions, labor forces were fragmented, and supply chains strained under constant bombardment. Blueprints called for materials that metallurgy shops could not reliably produce, and the resulting substitutions introduced hidden weaknesses into every weld and plate. The iron logic of engineering was now being undermined by the economic reality of a nation at war on all fronts. Early test runs revealed the consequences. Engines overheated on moderate inclines, transmissions groaned under the immense weight. Trial crews reported breakdowns after dis. Chances that would have been acceptable for a prototype, but troubling for a vehicle intended for rapid deployment. Deadlines, however, left little room for revision. Officials demanded results, and production lines began before testing could answer the questions engineers feared most. The tank was declared a technical marvel, a triumph of German ingenuity, even as those closest to its construction recognized the fragility woven beneath its armor. Celebrations accompanied its introduction, speeches praising its power and silhouette. But beneath the layers of steel lay a design stretched to its limits, an emperor built upon foundations already showing strain. And as the first units prepared for deployment, few understood how quickly those hidden weaknesses would shape the machine's fate on the battlefield that awaited it. For the young Panzer crews selected to operate the Tiger II, the assignment carried the weight of honor. Many had grown up hearing stories of the early war years, when German armor advanced with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. Now, in the late months of 1944, that confidence had faded, but the arrival of the Tiger II rekindled a fragment of it. Recruits spoke of the machine with quiet reverence, as if simply being chosen to crew it marked them as part of an elite lineage. In barracks and training yards, they imagined themselves at the head of armored breakthroughs, the tank's presence clearing a path where none had existed the day before. Training programs reinforced this belief by highlighting the tank's strengths, its impenetrable frontal armor, its formidable 88 gun, its supposed ability to decide engagements with a single, well-placed shot. Instructors showcased diagrams of angled plates and ballistic advantages, each detail suggesting superiority. Yet between these official teachings, softer conversations emerged. Whispers circulated about overheating engines, about gearboxes that locked under strain, about breakdowns during demonstration runs. These warnings were not part of the curriculum, but they traveled from one group of trainees to the next, shaping a subdued undercurrent beneath the prevailing pride. Veterans who had served in Tiger battalions during earlier campaigns added another dimension to the narrative. They carried memories of reliability issues, of nights spent repairing transmissions under enemy fire, of towing operations that taxed entire companies. Their tone was measured rather than fearful. They urged caution, explaining that the Tiger II was not a machine to be driven aggressively, but one to be handled with precision. To them, it was a powerful but sensitive instrument, a weapon that rewarded discipline and punished haste. Their stories traced the line between confidence and overconfidence, a distinction many recruits did not fully grasp. Daily life and training soon revealed the tank's complexity. Before moving the Tiger II even a few meters, crews followed long checklists: oil temperatures, fuel mixtures, track tension, gearbox settings. Each item reflected the engineering compromises embedded in the design. What seemed from a distance to be an indestructible mass of steel required constant attention. Drivers learned to listen for subtle changes in engine pitch. Loaders practiced routines that seemed almost ceremonial in their precision. The machine demanded a kind of mechanical literacy rarely required of earlier tanks. Driving instructors reinforced this expectation with an admonition repeated often enough to become doctrine. Mistreat it once, and it will punish you. They spoke from experience, recalling snapped pins, burnt clutches, and steering failures caused by the smallest lapse in procedure. Their warnings carried no theatrics, only the sober recognition that power and fragility were intertwined more tightly in the Tiger II than many realized. Yet pride remained a dominant force. For young crewmen, belief became its own form of armor, insulating them from doubts that surfaced in the maintenance yards. They trusted the machine because they needed to, because in a war turning steadily against them, certainty offered a rare form of solace. But as these men prepared for their first combat deployments, the contrast between confidence and mechanical reality was already widening, setting the stage for the moment when belief would be tested by forces they could neither predict nor control. The first deployment marches revealed a truth no blueprint had fully captured. As Tiger II columns moved out from their staging areas, the earth itself seemed to recoil. Asphalt cracked beneath the 68-ton weight, forming long fractures that trailed behind the treads like scars on a wounded landscape. Rural bridges, built decades earlier for horse carts and tractors, collapsed under the tank's approach, sometimes before a single vehicle had crossed. Even the machine's own tracks suffered under the strain. Pins sheared, guide teeth bent, and long metal segments twisted from T. The pressure of navigating roads never meant to bear such mass. Each kilometer became an argument between the tank and the infrastructure that surrounded it. Fuel convoys struggled to maintain the pace. The Tiger II burned fuel at nearly 3 times the rate of an American Sherman, transforming every movement into a logistical operation. Drivers watched their gauges drop quickly, knowing that a long march could empty the tank before it ever reached combat. Fuel trucks raced ahead to establish refueling points, but shortages were inevitable. Columns stalled on forest roads and village outskirts, their engines silent as crews waited for the next delivery. The machine's appetite, so easily justified in theory, consumed time and initiative in practice. Mechanics faced their own battles. Spare parts for the Tiger II were scarce, often improvised or redirected from other units. A single broken gearbox could delay the movement of an entire battalion, forcing officers to recalculate marches that were already precariously timed. Workshops reported long queues of immobilized tanks, their hulls open like wounded bodies awaiting treatment. The complexity that inspired awe in training now demanded skilled labor that Germany could no longer provide in abundance. Every repair became a negotiation between necessity and limited resources. Transporting the Tiger II by rail offered no relief. Standard flat cars groaned under its weight, and many required reinforcement before they could carry the load. This reduced the number of available routes, channeling movements through specific stretches of rail that were themselves vulnerable to Allied air attacks. The tank's strategic mobility, so critical in a war increasingly defined by speed, narrowed with each logistical restriction. What had been conceived as a breakthrough weapon found itself confined by the very systems meant to deliver it to battle. Commanders quietly adjusted their plans. Routes were rerouted to avoid weak terrain, bridges were bypassed or reinforced, and timetables expanded to account for the tank's slower, more deliberate pace. These changes slowed operational tempo, creating gaps between units and disrupting coordinated offensives. The Tiger II could dominate open ground, but the journey to that ground required a level of support the shrinking German war machine struggled to provide. Yet belief endured. Crews and officers alike reassured themselves that once the Tiger II reached the front, its presence would justify every delay and every broken road. The machine's burdens were heavy, but so too were the expectations that accompanied it. What none of them yet understood was that another challenge awaited, a battlefield reality that would test the Tiger II far more severely than any march through the countryside. Deep within the Tiger II's armored shell, the limits of German engineering were measured not in armor thickness or gun caliber, but in the quiet protest of machinery pushed beyond its design. At the center of this struggle lay the Maybach HL 230 engine, an engine conceived for vehicles weighing 45 tons, now forced to propel nearly 70. On paper, its 700 horsepower seemed sufficient. In reality, it labored with every movement, working at the edge of its tolerance from the moment the starter motor engaged. The strain was not dramatic. It was cumulative, a steady erosion of reliability hidden beneath the rhythmic pulse of pistons fighting weight they were never meant to bear. The consequences emerged quickly during marches. After only a few kilometers, temperature gauges crept into the red, forcing crews to halt and open engine hatches to release the trapped heat. The process became ritualistic. Pause, cool, inspect, hope the readings would fall before enemy aircraft appeared overhead. Crews learned to recognize the faint metallic scent that accompanied overheating, a warning they could neither ignore nor fully prevent. Even in winter, when frost clung to the tank's exterior, the engine compartment radiated an intensity that made repairs difficult. Heat, like an unseen adversary, stalked the Tiger II wherever it went. If the engine strained, the transmission suffered. Overloaded and overstressed, the complex gear system became the tank's most frequent point of failure. Shifts that should have been smooth felt heavy, gears slipped or refused to engage. Grinding sounds echoed through the hull during even moderate maneuvers. Transmission failures immobilized tanks at crossroads, forest trails, and village squares, locations chosen not by strategy, but by the unpredictable moment when the mechanical burden became too great. Recovery crews grew accustomed to the sight of a Tiger II sitting motionless, its crew standing beside it with resigned familiarity. No enemy shot was required. Physics was opponent enough. Engine fires added another layer of danger. Fuel lines, oil leaks, and overheated components created conditions in which ignition was an ever-present risk. Crewmen kept fire extinguishers within arm's reach, and they used them often. Smoke curling from rear vents did not always signal catastrophe, but it demanded immediate action. Many crews could recount moments when a small flame flickered into view, threatening to turn a 70-ton fortress into a furnace. These incidents rarely made official reports, yet they shaped daily life inside the hull. Fear of the unseen, of flame and heat rather than shells, became part of the Tiger II experience. Beneath the hull, another weakness lurked. The final drives, responsible for transferring engine power to the tracks, bore the full punishment of steering such a massive machine. Tight turns or uneven ground placed enormous stress on their gears. Teeth snapped under load, leaving tanks stranded mid-turn, their tracks locked at awkward angles. A single failure could delay entire units, forcing commanders to adjust routes and timetables once again. The final drives had been engineered with care, but not for this degree of weight, not for this length of war, and not under these conditions. Mechanics responded with ingenuity. Field workshops welded reinforcements onto gear housings, designed makeshift cooling improvements, and scavenged parts from immobilized vehicles to keep others moving. Improvisation became a necessity as spare parts dwindled. Each fix stretched the machine's operational life a little further, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Tiger II required constant intervention simply to remain mobile. Its strength, armor, firepower, presence was undeniable, yet these assets came at a cost its engine and drivetrain were never meant to pay. In this contradiction lay the tank's defining irony. The heavier its armor, the more impressive its silhouette, the more catastrophic the internal strain became. Every victory of steel invited the failure of the machinery that supported it. The Tiger II embodied the paradox of late-war German design, brilliance pursued at the expense of sustainability. And as crews prepared to take these temperamental giants into actual combat, none could fully predict how the battlefield itself would magnify those hidden weaknesses, turning mechanical strain into tactical vulnerability and promise into peril. As German forces fell back toward their shrinking borders, the Tiger II, designed for decisive breakthroughs, found itself serving a very different purpose. It was no longer an instrument of advance, but a companion of retreat, compelled to undertake marches far longer and more arduous than its designers had ever intended. Each withdrawal required the tank to cover dozens of kilometers across damaged roads and improvised routes, and with every mile the strain increased. The immense weight that once symbolized invulnerability now pressed relentlessly against bearings, gears, and tracks already battered by months of overuse. Winter amplified every weakness. Lubricants that should have flowed smoothly through the gearbox thickened or froze, transforming precise mechanical interactions into stiff, grinding movements. Drivers felt resistance through the control levers, a physical reminder that the cold was no less an adversary than the enemy advancing behind them. Crews carried small heating torches and blankets to thaw critical components before attempting to start the engine, yet even these efforts offered only temporary reprieve. The Tiger II, a machine of steel and mathematics, became vulnerable to the ordinary physics of frost. To prevent catastrophic cooling damage, crews often let the Maybach engine idle during rest periods, burning scarce fuel simply to keep its temperature above the threshold where metal contracted dangerously. Fuel, already rationed, vanished at an alarming rate. Tank commanders calculated their remaining distance not in terrain features, but in liters, knowing that a stalled Tiger II could not be easily towed and would likely be abandoned. The irony deepened. A weapon built to dominate open fields could be defeated by a cold night and an empty fuel drum. American air superiority forced further adaptation. Daylight movement became increasingly risky as Allied fighter-bombers patrolled the skies, turning any large armored column into a target. The Tiger II's massive profile, so imposing on the battlefield, made camouflage difficult. As a result, marches shifted to the night, when visibility was poor and navigation uncertain. Darkness concealed the tanks from aircraft but increased the likelihood of accidents. Frozen ditches, unseen obstacles, and narrow forest paths claimed vehicles not through enemy action, but through misjudgment and the inherent unwieldiness of a 70-ton machine. In these conditions, even a single broken track link could immobilize a Tiger II for hours. Crews dismounted into snow and mud to wrestle with steel components weighing dozens of kilograms. Each repair became a race against exposure and enemy proximity. A tank halted for too long, risked being discovered by patrols or aircraft. More often, immobilized vehicles were left behind, their useful parts stripped before the hull was destroyed to prevent capture. Cannibalization became routine practice. What had once been a battalion on paper diminished piece by piece as functional components were harvested from those that could no longer move. Every kilometer took on the character of a contest, not a struggle against enemy fire, but against the physics of weight, cold, friction, and fatigue. Crews felt themselves aging with the machine, sharing its weariness as their own. The road beneath them became a silent adversary, unpredictable and unforgiving. The Tiger II could defeat an enemy tank with a single shot, yet it required extraordinary effort to defeat the road it traveled. And as these long marches continued, a deeper realization settled over those who served within the massive vehicle. Before the Tiger II could prove itself in battle, it first had to survive the journey. Few understood how profoundly that journey would shape its legacy, or how the greatest test of the machine still lay ahead, on terrain where even steel would struggle to endure. As the Tiger II's shortcomings became impossible to ignore, German engineers searched for remedies that could preserve the promise of the machine without confronting the uncomfortable truth at its core. One proposal centered on a lighter turret variant, an attempt to reduce rotational strain, improve balance, and ease pressure on the already overburdened drivetrain. Drafts circulated among design offices, showing simplified angles and reduced armor thickness. On paper, the revisions seemed plausible. In practice, they collided with the chaos of late-war production. Factories operated under bombardment, skilled labor was scarce, and even the existing turret lines struggled to maintain output. A lighter variant remained a sketch on thin wartime paper, a solution conceived too late to matter. Efforts turned next toward the running gear. Revised track designs, wider and more stable, were intended to distribute weight more effectively across soft ground. Test results were promising. The new tracks reduced the likelihood of bogging down and lowered stress on the final drives, but the supply network that had once fed German armored divisions was now fractured. Rail lines lay in ruins, fuel convoys were cut apart from the air, and shipments of replacement tracks dwindled as materials were diverted elsewhere. Some Tiger II units received the upgrades. Many did not. Inconsistency became its own enemy, leaving battalions divided between those with marginal improvements and those bound to the original, fragile design. Field workshops supplemented official upgrades with improvisation. Welders reinforced weak points on the suspension. Mechanics adjusted cooling systems and improved maintenance routines, shaving minutes from repair times and extending engine life by precious increments. These modifications, often devised through trial and necessity, revealed the ingenuity that frontline crews relied upon, and yet none of them addressed the fundamental problem. Weight imposed itself on every movement, every turn, every kilometer. No weld could lighten the tank. No new procedure could change the physics of 70 tons. As mechanical failures multiplied, some commanders found a different use for the Tiger II, one that sidestepped mobility entirely. They positioned the tanks as immobile strongpoints, burying their hulls behind earthworks so that only the turret remained visible. In these positions, the Tiger II became a fortress, its 88 gun commanding vast fields of fire without the strain of travel. It was an adaptation both practical and symbolic. A weapon built for breakthrough now served as a fixed guardian of ground that Germany could scarcely afford to lose. The transformation reflected the realities of a nation in retreat, reshaping the purpose of its most ambitious machine. For the crews, the shift was painful. They had trained to maneuver, to strike, to embody the armored spearhead that German doctrine had celebrated for years. Watching a Tiger II relegated to static defense felt, to many, like a diminishment of its identity. Some crewmen spoke of the tank with the reverence once reserved for earlier war icons. Losing one to enemy fire was expected. Losing one to a broken gearbox or snapped track felt like sacrilege. They urged commanders to preserve the machines, to avoid unnecessary marches, to treat each Tiger II as irreplaceable, because increasingly it was. Training programs responded to the growing crisis. Gone were the lessons centered on sweeping offensives or coordinated armored thrusts. In their place came instruction on survival procedures, how to detect early signs of mechanical failure, how to minimize stress during turns, how to abandon and disable a vehicle if capture became imminent. These sessions carried an unmistakable undertone. Crews were no longer preparing to win battles. They were preparing to endure their machines, managing risk, prolonging function, delaying the inevitable. Every adaptation, every modification, every whispered warning carried a quiet acknowledgement. The Tiger II was becoming an exhausted relic even as it entered service in greater numbers. It was a masterpiece trapped inside its own contradictions. A tank too powerful to ignore, too complex to sustain, and too heavy to fulfill the role for which it had been designed. And yet fate had one more test in store. Ahead lay the battlefields where theory would collide with reality, and where the Tiger II would finally reveal whether its legend could survive the weight of its own construction. By December 1944, as winter tightened its grip on the Western Front, German High Command prepared a final gamble, an ambitious counteroffensive through the Ardennes. In the plans drafted in dimly lit headquarters, Tiger II units were to serve as the armored spearhead, the weight that would break the Allied line and create the momentum for a renewed advance. Orders traveled swiftly to the battalions positioned behind the front. The heavy tanks were to move at once, support the assault, and force a breakthrough that could alter the course of the war. For the crews, the announcement carried equal measures of pride and foreboding. The Ardennes were not forgiving terrain, and their machines had already shown the limits of their endurance. Long road marches began before sunrise, when shadows still covered the frost-coated landscape. The timing was not chosen for stealth alone. Allied fighter bombers dominated the daylight sky, reducing any armored movement to a target-rich opportunity. To avoid the inevitable air attacks, the Tiger II columns crept forward in the half-light of dawn, engines rumbling through the frozen stillness. Drivers relied on dim headlamps masked for blackout conditions, navigating narrow roads cut through dense forest. The early morning cold made every mechanical sound harsh and metallic, an auditory reminder that the tanks were being pushed at the very edge of their capabilities. As the columns entered the rolling terrain of the Ardennes, steep hills revealed the full cost of the Tiger II's immense mass. Even with throttle wide open, the Maybach engine struggled to propel the tank upward, its revolutions rising into a strained, hollow roar. Exhaust plumes formed pale clouds against the winter air. Inside the hull, crews felt vibrations intensify as the vehicle fought gravity with imperfect strength. The icy inclines demanded full engine power, and each ascent risked overheating, gearbox slippage, or track damage. What the designers had intended as a battlefield titan groaned under the simple challenge of a snow-covered forest road. Breakdowns began long before the battalions reached their assembly areas. One tank halted on a hillside, smoke drifting from its engine deck. Another shed a track on a sharp, frozen bend. Recovery crews attempted repairs in the biting cold, but each immobilized Tiger II became another obstacle on roads too narrow for detours. Columns backed up for kilometers as officers struggled to keep their units moving. Reports filtered through the ranks. This tank had lost oil pressure, that one had snapped a final drive, another had burned through its clutch. None of these failures came from enemy action. They were the mechanical toll of forcing a 70-ton design through terrain that punished every flaw. Fuel shortages compounded the struggle. The Ardennes offensive required rapid movement, yet fuel depots were already strained by months of Allied bombing and stretched supply lines. Tank commanders received partial refills rather than full loads, forcing them to ration every kilometer. Regiments scheduled to arrive together instead moved in fractured groups, separated by hours as fuel convoys attempted to keep pace. Some Tiger II companies spent entire nights waiting beside snow-covered roads, their engines idling only long enough to prevent freezing. The offensive clock continued to tick, indifferent to their delay. Officers began to send messages up the chain of command, warnings that the heavy tanks might never reach the front lines in meaningful numbers. They listed broken transmissions, stalled columns, and fuel shortages that made movement unpredictable. But higher command, committed to the broader strategy, responded with only a single directive: advance. The Tiger II was essential to the plan, and the plan would not change. As orders repeated through radio static, crews tightened their gloves, adjusted their scarves, and returned to their stations. The road ahead remained the same, even if the machines beneath them faltered. For the men inside the hulking vehicles, the march toward the Ardennes became a test not of firepower, but of endurance. Every hour revealed a new gap between the Tiger II's intended purpose and its lived reality. Yet the offensive demanded their presence, and the winter roads stretched forward with a cold, indifferent certainty. And beyond those roads waited the forests and villages where the Tiger II would finally meet the enemy, not as an idea, but as a machine whose limits would be laid bare under fire. In the opening days of the Ardennes offensive, the Tiger II's greatest adversary revealed itself, not in the muzzle flash of American guns, but in the grinding protest of its own machinery. One platoon, tasked with reaching a ridge overlooking a key crossroads, lost 2 tanks before noon. The first fell behind when its gearbox seized without warning, the lever stuck in mid-shift as if frozen in time. The second succumbed minutes later, gears grinding into a metallic shriek before locking entirely. Both tanks rolled to a stop on the roadside, their massive silhouettes casting long shadows across snow-packed earth. Not a single enemy round had been fired. The defeat came from within. Farther along the route, another crew confronted a different failure. Navigating a hillside turned slick with frost, their Tiger II abruptly lurched, halted, and refused to move. The final drive, already notorious among mechanics, had locked solid. The engine revved helplessly, tracks refusing to respond. The crew tried every procedure they had memorized, but the drivetrain remained frozen, a 70-ton anchor welded in place by mechanical strain. Eventually, after hours of futile effort, they abandoned the tank. The hillside fell silent, broken only by the soft hiss of cooling metal. The enemy was miles away, blissfully unaware of the victory they had just been handed. Mechanics, already stretched thin, arrived where they could. They worked beneath freezing winds that swept through the Ardennes, kneeling in snow while blowtorches sputtered against metal cold enough to crack tools. Bolts frozen solid required direct flame before they would even consider turning. Sleeves stiffened with frost, gloves fused momentarily to steel surfaces. Every repair took longer than the manuals envisioned. Every minute lost tightened the noose around the offensive's timetable. Men who once prided themselves on precision now labored simply to keep the machines from surrendering to the weather. Yet even the most determined effort could not compensate for absence. Replacement parts, transmissions, final drives, track sections were supposed to arrive by truck from depots farther east. Instead, supply lines buckled under the pressure of Allied air attacks, fuel scarcity, and impassable roads. Messages requesting components returned only silence or apologies. Mechanics cannibalized what they could, removing parts from immobilized vehicles to keep others moving. But even this grim efficiency reached its limit. Tanks that might have been repaired in days now sat idle, slowly buried under new snowfall, their usefulness melting away with the fading prospects of the offensive. Some Tiger IIs never failed in dramatic fashion at all. They simply ran dry. Traffic jams stretched for kilometers across narrow Ardennes roads, armored vehicles idling for hours as convoys struggled to navigate frozen choke points. The Maybach engine, enormous and hungry, consumed fuel even while stationary. As gauges dropped below critical levels, commanders shut down engines to conserve what little remained, only to discover later that frigid temperatures made restarting impossible. One by one, these great machines went silent, cold-soaked and lifeless, monuments to a fuel supply that could no longer sustain them. Their crews watched helplessly, knowing that once the tanks stopped, the offensive around them would slow in turn. All the while, American forces remained largely unaware of the quiet catastrophe unfolding in the forests. Artillery batteries, positioned miles away and firing intermittently at suspected German movements, had no knowledge that their shells were unnecessary. Fighter pilots scanning roads from above saw scattered vehicles, but did not grasp the scale of the breakdowns hidden beneath snow-covered canopies. No coordinated defense was required to blunt the advance. No concentrated firepower needed to be summoned. The Tiger II units were succumbing to an enemy that never aimed a weapon. With every immobilized tank, momentum drained from the German attack. What should have been a rapid armored thrust turned into a slow-motion crawl. Officers radioed increasingly dire updates. Platoons reduced to a single functional vehicle, battalions scattered across roadsides, crews stranded beside machines too heavy to move and too valuable to leave. The timetable for reaching key objectives stretched into impossibility. By the time the extent of the mechanical collapse became clear, the truth could no longer be denied. The offensive was slowing, not from Allied resistance, not from the thunder of artillery or the fire of tank destroyers, but from the quiet surrender of machinery pushed past its limits. And ahead, beyond the failing engines and frozen roads, awaited the battles where the Tiger II would finally meet enemy fire. long after so many had already fallen without a single shot being exchanged. As the German lines began to unravel in the winter of 1944, the men who served inside the Tiger II were forced into decisions their training had never prepared them for. The doctrine that once emphasized decisive armored thrusts had shifted into something far more desperate. Now every crew faced a narrowing triangle of choices: fight where they stood, retreat along roads already choked with wreckage, or abandon the machines that had been entrusted to them as symbols of German engineering pride. None of these paths felt honorable. All of them felt inevitable. The Tiger II, once imagined as a guardian of the Reich, could no longer guarantee even the safety of its own crew. One crew, ordered to hold a forest approach until reinforcements arrived, found that reinforcement would never come. Their Tiger II had thrown a track hours earlier, rendering the tank immobile in a shallow ditch. Under intermittent American small arms fire, the commander made the final call. The crew destroyed their radio first, smashing valves and ripping wiring from the panel. They attempted to ignite the hull by dousing the engine compartment with fuel, but the damp winter air fought every spark. Flames sputtered out, refusing to consume the armored giant. The tank, designed to withstand the worst the battlefield could offer, stubbornly resisted even its own destruction. Realizing time had run out, the men gathered what equipment they could carry. Snow muffled their steps as they slipped into the woods, glancing back at the hulking silhouette they had served for months. Leaving a Tiger II intact felt like abandoning a comrade, yet to stay beside it was to risk capture or worse. Their retreat into the tree line marked a quiet, heavy moment, the surrender of a machine without its crew ever raising a white flag. Hours later, as the forest fell silent again, American infantry moved cautiously along the road. They had expected a fierce engagement. Intelligence reports warned that a Tiger II could dominate this ground with a few well-placed shots. Instead, they found an immobile giant resting in the ditch, its gun pointing uselessly toward empty trees. The infantrymen spread out, half expecting an ambush, half convinced the tank must still be manned. Only after several minutes of tense observation did they realize the truth. The enemy had gone. The duel they had prepared for had evaporated into the cold air. Sherman crews arrived soon afterward, circling the German tank with a mixture of caution and curiosity. The Tiger II dwarfed their vehicles, casting long shadows across the snow. Its armor plates, thick and sloped, bore the promise of lethality they had long feared. Yet here it was, silent, cold, and utterly powerless. The Americans approached it like archaeologists studying the remnants of a toppled monument. They traced their hands along the weld seams, examined the suspension, and marveled at the size of the 88 gun. Each detail told a story, not of battlefield dominance, but of mechanical overreach and the strain of a war Germany could no longer sustain. Engineers arrived next, carrying cameras and notebooks. They recorded every angle, every hatch, every stress fracture. They photographed the welded joints, the transmission access panels, the scars of failed repairs. When they opened the engine compartment, they found evidence of overheating, oil leakage, and early-stage gearbox failure. What had been described in briefings as an invincible foe now revealed itself as a machine locked in constant battle with its own design. The Allies were not simply capturing equipment. They were uncovering the realities behind a weapon whose reputation had traveled farther than its capabilities. Slowly, a broader understanding settled in. For months, Allied commanders had prepared for the Tiger II as though it represented the pinnacle of German armored warfare, a threat that could halt advances and impose costly engagements. But standing beside the abandoned vehicle, with its cold engine and half-repaired track, officers recognized a different truth. This was not a wonder weapon poised to alter the war's trajectory. It was a testament to the limits of German industry, a weapon more formidable in theory than in sustained combat. By the time the examinations were complete and the photographs developed, one conclusion had become unmistakable. The Tiger II was dangerous, but its danger lived largely on paper, amplified by rumor and expectation. The reality lay rusting on a roadside, surrendered not through defeat in battle, but through the slow collapse of the machinery that once gave it life. And ahead, the Allies would soon encounter more such giants, each one offering the same silent confession about the gulf between aspiration and endurance in the final mont. A chess of the war. When American ordnance officers received their first intact Tiger II, they approached it not as soldiers confronting a weapon, but as engineers confronting a puzzle. The tank stood on a quiet stretch of captured road, its engine cold, its hatches forced open earlier by infantry. Teams arrived with tools, notebooks, and cameras, prepared to disassemble the German giant piece by piece. What they sought was not merely intelligence on an enemy vehicle, but insight into the industrial philosophy that had created it. The Tiger II was more than a battlefield opponent. It was a statement of how Germany imagined war, and how that vision had begun to strain against reality. As components came apart, the officers recorded observations with meticulous care. They admired the precision of the gun mount, the clean machining of the 88 breech, and the clever angling of the frontal armor. They noted how the turret's shaping minimized vulnerable points, and how the optical sights offered clarity unmatched by most Allied designs. In several areas, the engineering revealed an undeniable brilliance, a dedication to quality that had shaped earlier German successes. But as they probed deeper, the admiration began to share space with something else: concern. Beneath the impressive exterior lay systems burdened by complexity, too delicate for the unpredictability of combat, and too demanding for an army fighting on shrinking resources. Reports soon reflected this duality. Officers acknowledged the Tiger II as an extraordinary feat of design, yet they documented how over-engineering had produced a machine whose strengths were constantly undermined by its weaknesses. The transmission, though sophisticated, carried torque loads far beyond its intended limits. The final drives were beautifully constructed, but structurally unfit for a 70-ton chassis. Even the suspension, admired for its smooth ride in theory, became a liability when exposed to the harsh logistics of wartime terrain. What emerged from the analysis was a clear pattern. Innovation overshadowed practicality, and refinement had been pursued at the expense of resilience. For Allied planners, the findings confirmed a lesson already forming through months of field experience. In a mobile war, reliability outweighed brute strength. A tank that could travel 50 kilometers without breaking down held more strategic value than one that could penetrate armor at extreme range but rarely reach the battlefield intact. Balanced performance, speed, maintainability, mechanical tolerance proved more decisive than exceptional firepower alone. The Tiger II demonstrated what happened when these principles were reversed. It was a masterpiece in isolation, but a burden in motion. This understanding began to influence long-term development. Engineers studying captured vehicles contributed their insights to future design philosophies, emphasizing simplified components, modular repairs, and engines proportionate to weight. The next generation of Allied armor would reflect these lessons, prioritizing endurance and ease of production over the pursuit of singular, overwhelming attributes. The Tiger II, unintentionally, had become a blueprint of what not to replicate. Among the soldiers who inspected the tank firsthand, reactions were more personal. Some expressed awe at its size and the authority of its silhouette, recalling how its reputation had once shaped entire engagements. Others felt a quiet pity, seeing in the immobilized hull a kind of mechanical exhaustion, a machine asked to bear more than any design could carry. Its thick armor and powerful gun told one story. Its seized gears and stripped track teeth told another. By the time the evaluations were complete, the Tiger II's battlefield reputation had begun to unravel. It remained respected as a formidable opponent, yet the myth of invincibility dissolved under the weight of evidence. Fear had magnified its presence, but reality revealed a weapon constrained by its own ambition. Feared, admired, yet frequently immobile, the Tiger II embodied the contradictions of late-war Germany, a fusion of brilliance and overreach. And as Allied forces continued their advance into the heart of the Reich, they would soon encounter the final chapter of the Tiger II's legacy, written not in steel, but in the consequences of a war that had demanded more from machines and men than either could long endure. In the decades after the war, historians traced the Tiger II's story not through battlefield anecdotes alone, but through the cold arithmetic of production and performance. Germany manufactured barely 500 of these heavy tanks, an extraordinary investment of materials, labor, and factory capacity, at a time when the nation could scarcely afford any of them. Yet when scholars charted how many reached the front, how many fought, and how many survived a single engagement, a sobering pattern emerged. For every Tiger II that fired its gun in sea, another had succumbed to mechanical failure long before meeting an enemy. The numbers revealed what wartime crews had learned through experience. The machine's greatest struggle was not against Allied armor, but against itself. Operational records painted this contradiction with stark clarity. Battalions reported vehicles lost to breakdowns on the very days they were issued. Engines overheated during transport. Transmissions seized on training grounds. Final drives snapped on routine marches. These failures were not outliers. They were the statistical backbone of the Tiger II's service history. Only a fraction of the tanks delivered to the front performed as intended, and even those often required extensive maintenance between short bursts of activity. The imbalance between the tank's production cost and its battlefield contribution became one of the defining inefficiencies of late-war Germany. Industrial shortages made such inefficiencies impossible to correct. By 1944, Germany lacked high-grade steel, precision tools, skilled labor, and uninterrupted factory operation. Allied bombing forced constant relocation of production, scattering supply chains and introducing inconsistencies into every component. Spare parts arrived unpredictably or not at all. Maintenance units worked with improvised tools, salvaged materials, and fading hope that the next shipment might include what they needed. The Tiger II was a machine that demanded perfection. The Reich that produced it could deliver only scarcity. In that gap lay the seeds of its downfall. Strategically, the tank's immobility became its defining limitation. Its weight restricted which bridges it could cross, which roads it could travel, and which railcars could transport it. Entire operations were reshaped to accommodate or avoid the presence of a single Tiger II company. When immobilized by breakdown, the tanks were nearly impossible to tow. When out of fuel, they became immovable bunkers. When surrounded, they were monuments waiting to be captured or destroyed. The Tiger II could dominate a battlefield when firing, but too often it never reached that battlefield at all. This reality exposed the natural limits of the German design philosophy that had guided armored development since the early years of the war. Bigger guns, thicker armor, and heavier chassis offered clear tactical advantages in duels, but they imposed strategic burdens that Germany's shrinking industrial base could no longer bear. The Tiger II represented the apex of that philosophy, a machine built to crush opponents head-on, yet incapable of sustaining itself across the operational distances that modern warfare demanded. Its virtues were impressive. Its consequences were decisive. As the Reich collapsed, the Tiger II became a reflection of the nation that created it. Both were formidable in appearance, ambitious in concept, and increasingly hollowed by shortages, overreach, and the relentless pressure of events. The tank's failures were not isolated mechanical accidents. They were symptoms of a broader unraveling, an industrial system straining under impossible demands, a strategic vision detached from practical limits, and a war effort that could no longer reconcile aspiration with reality. In the end, the Tiger II stood as a monument to excess, a weapon crafted with extraordinary skill yet burdened by the very strengths that were meant to define it. It was powerful but too heavy, advanced but too fragile, feared yet often immobilized. A giant whose greatest enemy was the weight of its own creation. And as the final months of the war approached, that weight would shape the last chapter of its story, where steel, ambition, and inevitability converged on the battlefields of a nation nearing its end. In the stillness that follows a battle's passing, the abandoned Tiger II took on a meaning far larger than its steel. It stood half-buried in frost, a monument not to victory, but to the contradictions that defined the final years of the war. Here was a machine conceived with mathematical precision and boundless ambition, yet undone by the ordinary forces of weight, friction, and time. Its presence on the roadside captured a paradox at the heart of Germany's armored doctrine, the belief that engineering brilliance could outpace the material realities closing in on every front. The Tiger II had been designed as a king of the battlefield. Instead, it became a relic of a nation struggling against limits it refused to acknowledge. No examination could deny the brilliance embedded in its form. The sloped glacis, the formidable 88mm gun, the thick interlocking plates, each spoke of a technological sophistication that had few peers in its era. But brilliance cannot override balance. The machine's strengths, magnified to their extreme, had birthed its downfall. Armor thick enough to turn enemy shells also imprisoned an engine too weak to move it. Firepower that promised dominance depended on a chassis that frequently collapsed beneath its own weight. Every design triumph carried a hidden consequence, and in the harsh arithmetic of war, these consequences accumulated faster than solutions could be devised. For the crews who once believed in the Tiger II's invincibility, the collapse of that faith carried a heavy emotional weight. They had trained for a weapon of destiny and found themselves serving a machine that demanded constant repair, constant vigilance, constant compromise. Many never fired its gun in anger. Some never reached the battlefield at all. Their humiliation was not loud or dramatic. It was a quiet, private reckoning with the gulf between expectation and reality. They were soldiers who had been promised a spearhead and instead received a burden, one they carried with a somber loyalty even as its failures multiplied. American soldiers who encountered the tank in its abandoned state confronted their own illusions. For months, fear had shaped their perception of the Tiger II. A shadow on the horizon, a rumor whispered across units, a threat invoked in briefings as though it were unstoppable. But standing beside the silent hull, they discovered that fear can exaggerate power as easily as propaganda can. The tank that had loomed in their imagination now revealed seams, vulnerabilities, and a kind of manufactured fragility. The enemy's most imposing weapon had been defeated not by fire, but by the realities of production, supply, and mechanical strain. Decades later, the Tiger II remains suspended between myth and lesson. Museums preserve its silhouette as a testament to what engineering can achieve when limits are disregarded or misunderstood. Enthusiasts admire its armor, its gun, its presence. Historians examine the broader context, the shortages that undermined its construction, the logistical burdens that crippled its movement, the battlefield conditions that exposed its contradictions. It stands today as both marvel and warning, a reminder that power without sustainability becomes a liability, and that the greatest weapons succeed not through singular strength, but through harmony between design, industry, and strategy. History remembers the Tiger II's impenetrable front plate and the long barrel that once promised to dominate the battlefield. But it also remembers the track pins that snapped under pressure, the transmissions that seized without warning, and the fuel tanks that ran dry long before the first shot was fired. It remembers the road where one machine, warm to the touch yet lifeless, marked the end of an idea. They built it to win a battle. It never even made it to the front.